Today on Conversations Aloud, we're discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict as seen from a journalist perspective who has been on the ground there. We're joined by Mark Patinkin, who is an award-winning journalist, is a writer for over 45 years, who has recently written a book about the regional conflict, which was actually for a short time banned by Amazon, titled The Holy Land at War, a journey
That's right.
through Israel,
Here it
the
is.
West Bank, and Gaza. Oh, there it is.
Nice to be with you, Hadi.
Perfect. So, for a lot of us, we who are witnessing what is happening in the region, we're witnessing it through the lens of social media, through TikTok, through Instagram. Um, so, it's really great to actually have a conversation with someone who's actually been there. Can you walk us through? Because a lot of journalists are not actually allowed to enter Gaza, from my understanding. Only a few are allowed. So, can you walk us through kind of your experience and journey going through across the fence into Gaza and that kind of experience of what you saw there?
Sure. And you're right that that the world has seen this through social media. And in fact, when this after October 7th, as a longtime columnist, I wrote a number of commentaries about the situation. And then I realized every tweet is a commentary, and my role as a journalist is to witness. So I went, and it's very difficult to get into Gaza. Uh, Frankly, international journalists cannot go in there on their own. They can only go in there with the Israeli army. And I did want to see both sides. So I spent many days finding the phone numbers of regular people inside Gaza and tracking them down. So I did get both sides. That going into Gaza itself, I went in on a open air Humvee with a few other journalists. You only get in there maybe once a month or so. And we go tearing down the fence on this kind of sandy, wet soil on the Israeli side, driving very fast because there are explosions going off nearby. And we took a hard left turn into Gaza through a part of the fence that had been blasted open by Hamas on October 7th. And there's a certain kind of irony that Israel is now attacking back through it. And our first stop was a tunnel that they had just found. It was the closest tunnel to the fence, only steps away. And we kind of were able, they'd excavated a dirt ramp to the tunnel. And we went down with with sand getting into our boots to see and look into the tunnel and realize this is where the war started that has led to an upheaval in the world.
How big is that tunnel?
And that tunnel is, let's see if I could find a picture of it. They had already blown it up so that I couldn't get all the way inside it. But here's a photo of me, as you can see,
Okay.
right by the tunnel itself, with an Israeli officer next to it. And there it is again, as you can see.
Yeah.
But they'd blown it up just then. It's near Khan Yunis, which is where fighting was going on, so close that you could hear the automatic weapons fire. And then at that point, you didn't see the typical dystopian look that we're used to in the media of Gaza, because this was still a buffer zone in the first quarter mile between Israel and Gaza itself. And but then we went on through what was a very destroyed neighborhood that looked very much post-apocalyptic. And it was a mile-long neighborhood of actually nice houses. Portions of Gaza were very nice. And of those hundreds of houses we saw, each one on a quarter acre or so, 2/3 of them had been destroyed in battle. And it makes you think and makes you wonder, did Israel have to do this much damage? But it also does make you wonder, why is Hamas not releasing the hostages and stopping the destruction of their homeland?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, when you went there, the fighting is actually happening in kind of these residential areas, and there's kind of, you were with the IDF, they were shooting, and there were shots kind of coming back from these houses.
At that point, I wouldn't say we weren't actually being targeted by fire there at that point, partly because the IDF is careful not to bring journalists directly into a fire zone. But there were a couple of times that bombs went off and smoke swept over us 15, 20 seconds later. That you could hear the automatic weapons fire a quarter mile away. or so. And in some ways, Hadi, that's more unsettling than these bombs when they went off. The soil kind of shook, the whole area shook. But the automatic weapons fire was more unsettling because you realize that's house to house combat,
Mhm.
and that kind of makes you realize just how close quarter war is in 2024.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, you've been to a number of different regions, post-war, pre-war, during war. How does this conflict compare when to the other regions that you've been or seen?
Well, I'll tell you, on both sides, it's an interesting question. I can answer that a lot of ways, but I was in the Beirut Civil War during the late 1980s. It goes back a while, but that was a terribly destructive war where things were in upheaval on both sides and life was not normal. That was when Westerners were being kidnapped by an early version by Hezbollah back then, because they were still beginning to dominate Beirut. But I'll tell you, on both sides, what I noticed, and it says something about Jews and Palestinians. On both sides, one of my surprises was that when you're not in the actual front lines, there's a surprising normalcy that's going on. When you go in Jerusalem, there's people there's sidewalk cafes are full, and people are biking and going to the beach. And when I went to Ramallah, which is really the capital of the West Bank, I was the only non-Palestinian face I saw during my day there among thousands of people, and the same when I went to Bethlehem on a different day to see the Palestinian side. And Bethlehem's depressed because there's no tourism, but Ramallah was vibrant. Ramallah also had vibrant street scenes and crowds. But when you scratch beneath the surface, whoever you talk to, they said, "Oh my God, the war has really upended my life." That both peoples, because of 77 years of on and off conflict, have the same similar spirit, both Jews and Palestinians. They continue to live. They continue to live and live their lives, even in the midst of this upheaval of war.
Yeah, it's almost to the point where when you have someone that's trying to eliminate you, you make it a point to ensure that your life is as normal as it could be in defiance of this other party that's trying to eliminate you. And it's funny you said that in some parts in West Bank and Israel, life is normal. When I went there, I found, even though it was not during the war, it was before, it was in 2020. I found every region very different. Like Ramallah is very vibrant place compared
Yeah.
to Hebron, which is also in West Bank, but that's very more kind of segregated religious kind of atmosphere. So, we hear a lot about the kind of economy in Israel kind of really being impacted. When you've been to Jerusalem this time around, I'm assuming you've been before. Is there anything that's different?
No, I have to say, Hadi, I found that that it's just what I said a moment ago, that there still seems to be a vibrancy to it. I mean, there are differences, of course, and when you go to the old city, through those amazing. You've been to the old city of
Yeah,
Jerusalem?
yeah, it's beautiful.
It's amazing.
Beautiful.
It's like you could hear the song of history in the limestone walls around
Yeah,
you.
it's like you've gone back
It's
in time. Like it's
Yeah,
just
yeah, it is,
yeah.
and you see when you go in the well, just to briefly answer your question, it's much quieter there. You know how the long kind of tunnel like walkways where near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus died and rose, and through the Muslim quarter towards the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. Those are usually full of merchants, and now it's very quiet. There's very few because tourism is
Is
down.
there a
But
tension? Because for a lot of people that have been there, they don't realize that in Jerusalem, the Arabs and the Jews and the Christians are all kind of like living next to each other and working in the same kind of area. Yes, there's these quarters. There's Muslim quarter, there's Jewish quarter, Christian quarter, there's Armenian quarter, but
yeah,
they're kind of all
pretty close to
together
ours.
there. But after a war, is that dynamic? Did you feel a difference in the air, intensity?
No, I didn't. I still, yeah, and when I walked through the old city as a journalist, I made a point of speaking um, to folks, mostly Arab folks there, and they were, they're right there near the Western Wall, running their merchant shops, and they're very ecumenical, if that's the right word. They're very proud. I talked to one young man who was running a shop, and he said, "I'm very proud. I have uh, keffiyehs right next to yarmulke keys, right next to Hamza hands, right next to crosses, and we embrace all religions here." And they say that they kind of joke that like it's the common religion here is the color of money, and we're here to make money. And but when you ask them, when you press them about it, they're pretty careful. They're pretty careful. And there was one kind of very notable merchant in the old city named Zach, as Zach's Antiquities. He's very well known. And I say, "So what's your background? Would you say are you an Israeli Arab, or what's your background?" He says, "I'm a Jerusalemite." And I like to say that to exempt myself from the politics. And others speak the same way within Israel, and that's kind of a metaphor or kind of a symbol of how, to answer your question, people really work hard at coexistence there. Jews, Arabs, Christians, all working together, especially within the old city.
Yeah. I want to continue the conversation on Israel side, but before we do that, I want to go back to Gaza. Having been on the ground, how does the reality in Gaza differ from what we often see in Western media coverage, or does it differ?
I don't think it does differ. I mean, it is when you go through. I'll see if I can find another photo for you. But when you go through Gaza, you see a lot of this. This is one of the. I took that photo. That's right outside the Jeep. That had been a very upscale neighborhood. In other words, the dystopian pictures we see, those are very common.
And
here,
was this taken in January 2024?
It was taken in January, yes,
2024.
8 or 9 months ago. But yeah, and then here's with people talking about how the fighting is going on, and here we had to stop it. That's a school, and Israeli soldiers at a school where there was a battle with Hamas that had stockpiled weaponry in the school, and so it's urban warfare, and it is a post-apocalyptic scene, and it's I think the one misperception would be, if I could, which I kind of alluded to earlier, Hadi, is that even though that picture I just showed was of tragic destruction, there were many other houses in that neighborhood that were still standing. They were very nice houses. They were 5 big houses on an acre of land. And so I think one misperception is that there were very lovely parts of Gaza.
Yeah, which we don't.
Fortunately, many of those have been destroyed. And, I talked to many people who are trying to cope with that now. And here's a really nice guy that I connected to. His name is Hasham Mana, and he's a spokesman for the Red Cross, who lives right in the heart of the battle zone. And he had his wife, who is Filipino Palestinian, was able to evacuate while pregnant. He's yet to meet his young son months later, but he's just committed to being with his people. And I was able to reach him by phone, and he, I said, "Well, after the war, what are you going to do? Are you going to rebuild or stay or join your wife elsewhere?" And he said, "I just don't know what there is to return to." He said, "The cafes where I used to sit with my good friends, the other places where we studied at the university, they're mostly destroyed." And of course, going forward, picturing his own kids, the education system, even the infrastructure is quite destroyed. So he does not know. And many people told me the same thing.
Yeah, I can only imagine, because Gaza is such a small place, and if you have most of the buildings being destroyed, that the place becomes foreign to you, because you cannot relate to any kind of corner or any shop or any cafe, because it's all kind of gone. When you speak to Gazans, what do they say about the war, about what happened? What's their kind of usual reaction, other than that, the devastation they feel about their country?
It's a great question, and it brings up something that we're not able to really cover well, and that's the people. I think there's a greater amount of people there, and I talked to some of them who who feel that Hamas brought this destruction upon them, but they don't dare say. And so I think there's also, it's maybe a little bit of an unfair branding that there's this kind of argument from one side that all the Gazan civilians were just as extreme as Hamas. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think many are heartbroken at what this war has brought down upon them. And, I learned that in Beirut too, when I was there during the Civil War. There were so many good souls that just felt caught up in this extremist new regime that Hezbollah was bringing there. And what I learned about life, Hadi, is that if 10% of the people are extremists with guns, they could run the other 90% and take over.
Yeah, I can believe that, and that's the unfortunate thing is that you've got this kind of extreme organization that's almost holding the people hostage, and then you've got another force bombing those people, and so what do the people? It's kind of like a hopeless situation for the people.
Yeah, it's really it is. I connected. One thing I tried to do is I was also in Gaza in 1991 during the Intifada, and I went on jeep patrol with an Israeli commander. And part of what I did in this book was 30 years later, I tracked down many of the people I met in 1991, and including that commander. 30 years later, he's now in his 60s. And but another person I met in Gaza in 1991, this is a more recent picture, but she was a humanitarian worker named Salwa Tibi. And so I met her 33 years ago. And so you saw that picture there. And I found her again today. And she sent me this picture, and that's her today in a tents where she has been where she was displaced and is now living, but still trying to continue her career as a humanitarian worker. And, she was very careful not to be political about it. She just said, the people just want to live. The people just want to live. And it's just you could see between the lines that she just, you're right. That she couldn't say that Hamas brought this down upon them. That's dangerous to say there. And I'm sure she is also is just devastated at the destruction of the war from the Israel side. But you can see between the lines, they just don't know why this war had to have started and why October 7th had to have happened. What did it accomplish?
Do you see, because it's really interesting that you actually spoke to the same people, 30 years ago. Do you see the mindset regarding their relationship with Israel, or how they view Israel, has changed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should add here that you're a very good interviewer. A lot of interviewers there are 15 questions and they jump from question to question. You're very good. You make it a conversation. You listen and respond to. So I think you should be a podcast.
I appreciate that. Try my best.
Yes, their attitude had changed. The Israeli Jeep commander that I mentioned that I saw, this is him. I took this picture of him in 1991. And he was that's outside the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. And I tracked him down. Here he is. There he is at age 68, 33 years later, same guy. And by the way, during that Jeep ride, we must have been hit by hundreds of rocks thrown by teenagers and young people, including one as young as 4 years old.
Wow.
And you may think that I'm exaggerating that, but I took this photograph out the back window of the Jeep.
Yeah.
And that's a child throwing a rock at an Israeli Jeep. But in terms of your question of how the attitude has changed in those years, the Israeli commander I showed you was a peacenik. And frankly, so were virtually all of the victims of October 7th on the Israeli side were peaceniks. Anybody that lived in the kibbutz, they wanted a two-state solution. Okay. They were in favor of Palestinian rights. And in fact, they wore pins that said Palestinian lives matter.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And yet they were the targets because all the people, they lived near Gaza because they believed in coexistence. And so they were the targets. And so that's one reason why people's attitudes have changed in Israel, that even those that were in favor of peace now were the targeted ones. And so in terms of that commander being a typical example of how their attitude has changed, during that time in 1991, when he was patrolling Gaza, he said, we should get out of Gaza. he told me, and let the Gazans build their country. And today he says he didn't expect it would turn into a territory run by an extremist Hamas leadership, and he feels that that peace is further away than ever. And
Looks like it.
he said differently. And 30 years ago, he would have said, "Oh, by 2024, of course, we will have a peaceful coexistence with some kind of an independent Palestinian entity, especially in Gaza, which really the Israelis had totally left." And now he says he wonders whether he'll see peace in his lifetime.
That's really unfortunate. In terms of the mindset of the Gazans you met, has that changed at all from 30 years ago?
You know, I think that's a broader question, Gotti, and it gets into some interesting answers. And when you say as the attitude of the Gazans change, I think the real question is the attitude of the Palestinians change. And what's the attitude? Did I see any change in the attitude on the West Bank, for example, as well? So I think the West Bank is really the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations, and where that any kind of a arrangement or any kind of a future is going to be told is on the West Bank. Of course, Gaza too. But I spent a day on Bethlehem as well, and I went with a young teacher who took me around just to see Bethlehem, and he took me to the home of a friend of his who has 5 sons, 3 of which are in Israeli custody now, and he's not even sure why. He thinks they were because of extremist Facebook postings, and he said that's typical here on the West Bank. Many of us have young male relatives that have been arrested, and but I will say this about the Palestinian outlook. That while I was sitting in this home, and let me add, I've never experienced hospitality like I have in the West Bank. I had never heard the word welcome so much when I, as a Western reporter from America, came in. And even as they asked me things like, why is your government supplying bombs to the Israelis to kill babies, as they said, in Gaza, even as they asked that of me, they showed great hospitality toward me. And so they were very welcoming, and they showed some interesting sides of Palestinian culture. I noticed at one point, despite a lot of deprivation and poverty there, that there's no homeless people in West Bank. And it kind of took me aback it's not something you necessarily notice, but at one point I kind of noticed and asked Omar, my friend who took me around, well, where are the homeless people? I said, we don't have homeless people. We look after each other. That's our culture. Mm. And so there's some very impressive parts of that, but there's another part of the culture that I have to be honest about that I found back in 1991 and I found still today. And that's at one point in this home where we were being served lunch and welcomed. He pointed to an older man, a photo on the wall that said, that's our patriarch. He's in his 90s. And he owned land in Israel. And all we want to do is get back to that land in Israel. And when I was in Gaza and I talked to young kids, I said, where are you from? And they said, oh, we're from Beersheba. And I said, wait, that's in Israel, isn't it? And I said, yeah, but that's our home. And I said, well, what's it like? And they said, oh, it's so beautiful with orange groves and green trees. And I said, oh, when were you there? And they said, oh, we've never been there, but that's our home. And so, and there is this attitude that I think is problematic, I'll say, that even though this gets into a political debate that we could get into in terms of rights of Palestinians versus Israelis, 3 generations later, I do find that both in 1991 and 2024, there's a tendency in the Palestinian, and among many Palestinians, to look backwards towards where their lives were back in even 1947 instead of looking forward towards building. And so there is, that was an attitude I saw on the West Bank and in Gaza that's similar today to where it was then. And that leads to a deeper political discussion about how we got to that point. But I think that's a factor that just has to be observed, that there is a tendency to look towards reclaiming the past rather than building the future, given the current reality.
Yeah, I think that's actually, there's a lot of bottlenecks that's stopping us into getting into kind of some kind of peace settlement. From the Arab side, I feel like that's one that you hit, right on the spot, which is the acceptance of Israel, acceptance of Israel being created and being okay with that. A lot of the Palestinians do not accept that part. Do you feel that is a kind of a caused by failed leadership from their side to kind of install a mindset of we're going to go back to what it was before, as opposed to how can we kind of create the future where we both exist?
I do think it's a failure of leadership, Heidi, but it's very complicated because it even rises to the level of, well, let me put it this way. When I visited that family out in Bethlehem, that was actually in a refugee camp. And as you, I'm sure, know, that many people don't know, they might think, oh, a refugee camp. So was that mean tents surrounded by fences? No, this is 3 generations later. What once was refugee camps after 1947, 48, have now turned into relatively impoverished areas of cities, but there's parts of the city, refugee camp, but they're still called a refugee camp because 3 or 4 generations later, I think it's the only case on earth where the United Nations still continues to label a people as refugees. And I think that also adds to the mindset that people consider themselves refugees. And what's the definition of being a refugee? You're in some kind of temporary holding pattern waiting to get, back to where you were. And so I think that's harmful that refugee status has continued. And, when I was there in 1991 in Gaza, I will say I talked to, kind of pictures too, but I don't want to waste too much time looking up pictures, but of a gentleman who was in a refugee camp there. And I said, don't you want to get out of this kind of more slum-like part of the city and build your own home in a better place? And he said, no, we want to stay in this refugee camp status because it reminds the world of where we have to get back to. And so I think that in some cases, not all. There are some beautiful cases of Gaza, beautiful parts of Gaza, and certainly in the West Bank, as I told you, Ramallah is a very vibrant place, as you know. It's great, and people have built and looked forward there. But there are parts of Palestinian culture that just is waiting to return to what they had rather than trying to build towards what could be. Not all.
Yeah.
But Ramallah, and you'll see the opposite in some cases, but there's that attitude.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that, and what adds to that is kind of, because obviously you need a partner, as the Israelis always say, a partner to peace, which they don't see in Gaza or in Hamas, for obvious reasons. But it's the same thing from the other side, which is they also don't see a partner in peace who is killing them and kind of destroying. When every family has a member that has been lost due to bombardment or killing, it's hard to imagine peace with that entity, which obviously adds to the fuel that let's focus on the past, because there is no future working with such a country like Israel that is killing us. Going to kind of the IDF soldiers, what is their mindset when you talk to them about why they're there? How do they kind of explain that?
Well, virtually everyone has a story. When you ask them that question, they say, well, I was on vacation in Thailand on October 6th. And then October 7th happened. And by October 8th, I had flown back overnight. And I was in the attacked area picking up bodies and parts of bodies. And it's hard to overstate what an apocalyptic impact October 7th has had on the Israeli psyche. Everybody has a story. Every Israeli you talk to will take out their phone and show you text messages they got from a friend or family member who were hiding in a secure room during the 12 hours that attack unfolded in real time, and many of them with terrible endings. So everybody's touched by that. Everybody knows a hostage. And so it's a very personal involvement that you've heard the statistic before that this was given Israel's population is 9 or 10 million with 7 million Jews or so. This would have losing 1,200 people on October 7th would have been like America losing 40,000 people on 9/11. And so it's had an extraordinary impact. But one thing I did also hear is there still is this mentality among Jews and among Israelis that even though we're 77 years or 75, 76 years after, almost 80 years actually after World War II, there's still a mentality that this is our one safe place on earth, that this is the only place we can count on being safe, especially now that we see these protests that seem to be riddled with anti-Semitism around the world. People are leaving France, are leaving Britain, to move to Israel because they have fears there. And there's a mentality, and you talk to the soldiers, this mentality of assuming they have to defend their country because it's the only place they have on earth. And more than one soldier, when I asked them, they said, my grandfather, when I was little, would tell me about how in World War way back, like 1900s, early around 1900, we had family members killed in Russian pogroms where Russians just came down on small Jewish villages. And there were hundreds of thousands of Jews killed during that period of the pogroms around 1900. And then, of course, there was the Holocaust itself, where 6 million were killed, and everybody in Israel has past family members who were killed in the Holocaust. And but these soldiers, these young, they're 25 or so. And look about your age. How old are you, Hadi?
I am 34, unfortunately. I wish I was
well,
25.
you're very well preserved. You're very well preserved. But they, 25, 30, even some that are, 34, they're still very young. And they said, of course, we know that's part of Jewish history and my family's history, but that's a long time ago. And I think, oh, Grandpa, it's not 1900 anymore in Russia. It's not 1944 anymore or 43 anymore in Germany. But then October 7th happened, and they told me they realized it is still 1900 in Russia, and it is 1943 in Poland. The same thing happened. We were victims of the pogrom. We were victims of the worst killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And so you'll hear that from Israeli soldiers, young Israeli soldiers, that this was a moment of enlightenment where they realized they still face the same forces of world of neighbors, but also world forces wanting to destroy Jews, and they were fighting to protect their country from what they feel would be complete destruction if they weren't able to defend it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who are not Jewish. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but if I was Jewish and you've had wherever you went, Russia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, just trying to eliminate your whole race, there is that kind of mentality of actually we have just that one nation that we must protect because that's the only place where we can be ourselves and we can govern ourselves and not kind of rely on something outside of us, because we've tried that and it hasn't worked out throughout hundreds of years. Most people don't realize the importance of that for Jewish people to have a nation for themselves. And when because I've spoken to a lot of the IDF soldiers, and they're so young. They're kids, pretty much. When I went to the settlements,
Yeah.
they're there to guard these settlements, and you talk to them. They also just want to live a normal life and have fun. But obviously, they have to do that as part of being part of Israel. The issue is a lot of people when they think about Israel, especially in the Arab world, they view Israel as the kind of what happens in the settlements in West Bank, which is expanding into West Bank, and is considered illegal by international standards. And then they consider Israel to be the IDF soldiers that cause massacres and kind of are killing just left, right, and center. Obviously, a lot of Israelis are not that, but that's the image they have, and so it's created what seems to be a lot of anti-Semitism all around the world, and they're not able to kind of disconnect kind of the lots of peaceful Israelis that want to live and coexist side by side versus maybe the ultra right wing government that's in place right now and the illegal settlements that are happening in West Bank. It's very hard for people to differentiate between those two things is what I feel.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if you talk to people in Israel, just on common folks walking around, most of them will say, we just want peace. As that Israeli Jeep commander said, that you're right. It's hard to people will focus on that, but the Israeli side would be that, we're responding to threats. West Bank's a little bit more complicated. I do agree with that. With the settlements are spreading there. I drove around with this teacher that I told you who took me around. He's very moderate. He doesn't like the Palestinian leadership. He certainly doesn't like Hamas, and he doesn't like the Palestinian Authority either. He says they're thieves, and that's part of the problem too. And part of why Hamas came to power is that the Palestinian Authority is seen as corrupt. But in terms of the settlements, yes, we were driving, and also in terms of what you said about how Israeli soldiers are perceived. We were driving out of Bethlehem to see his village, and actually it took a long time because the Israelis have begun to cut off roads for security reasons, which is one big frustration on the West Bank. The 20, 30-minute trips have turned now into 3-hour trips
Mm.
through circuitous routes and roadblocks. And at one point, we approached an Israeli roadblock, and I noticed what seemed to be a settlement, on a hill nearby because it was newer, wider stone homes. And I pointed and said, "Hey, Omar, what's that over there?" And as I was pointing, he quickly grabbed my arm like this and pulled my arm down and said, "Never point when you're near an Israeli checkpoint because they're very jumpy and they'll mistake it for a gun and shoot first and ask questions later." And so just responding to what you said about how Israelis are perceived, that was a glimpse. I wasn't worried about it, but maybe there's a reason to be worried like Omar was. And in terms of the settlements themselves, look, there's an argument to be made that there are 2 million, put it this way, Israeli settlers will say there's 2 million Arab Israelis living in Israel. Shouldn't there be a right for Jews to live on the West Bank? And I will say that some of the settlements are encroaching. And the way Omar put it is he used an Arabic word. You speak Arabic,
Yeah.
Hadi? So you know this phrase, shway, shway?
Yeah. Yes. Slowly, slowly.
What is that? Huh?
Slowly, slowly.
Yes, little bit,
Little.
shway, shway. And that's, he said, how they're spreading.
Yeah, it's because when you look at West Bank, it actually looks like a big area, but in reality, only I think 18% is governed by the Palestinian Authority, which is I think Area A. The majority of it is actually governed by the Israelis, and the what's governed by the Palestinians, they're kind of referred to as islands, I think, because they're kind of covered by these other areas that are actually Israel controlled, where the Palestinians are not allowed to build homes or actually live there or anything like that. And when you add to that the demolishing of houses that's happening in East Jerusalem and West Bank to build these settlements, again, it's very difficult to imagine that being your peace partner to work together for a future of coexistence.
Yeah, it is. What's interesting though is that this is another area that settlers, that just like you said, it's sometimes there's a perception that all of Israel are, soldiers shooting in Hebron.
Yeah.
And it's same thing with the settlers. There are, and I'm the first to say, because I heard the stories and I talked to people, the Palestinians who were on the receiving end of it. There are some very extremist settlers who are violent to their neighbors. And what's shocking is most settlers are just regular folks, professionals, lawyers, whatever, who just found that they bought a home on the West Bank because you get a 3,000 square foot home on the West Bank for the same price you get a small condo in Jerusalem. And so it's just what motivates people everywhere. It's just good property values. And many of the folks, many of the settlers, they are settlers because they live out there, but they're just regular folks who are living there the same way that you or somebody comparable might live in a suburb of Jerusalem, because that's where many of the settlements are. And so it's this interesting contrast. There are the extremists, but I would say many, if not most settlers are just, regular folks who just see these as desirable suburban-like communities.
So you think it's a financial thing for a lot of them to move there?
For many of them, it's some of them are just, look, I've got a green lawn here and I couldn't get that in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's challenging because that's the land that's supposed to be for the future Palestinian state, and those settlements are expanding, right? Which
I agree with that. I agree with that. But it's interesting that many there are not there's an old term called Brooklyn cowboys, where you got these extremist Jews from, that'll move over there and homestead on the east and out of pure ideology. And, there's ideology, and then there's moneyology, and there's just, it's a good mortgage, and it's a nice place to live. So it's as you have pointed out, as I saw on both sides, not all Palestinians are extremists. Not all Israelis or settlers are crazy. It's a very complicated mosaic over there.
Yeah. And just to end this on the kind of the peace, and when you had those conversations with the Palestinians, with the Israelis about what does peace look like. Was there even, following 7 October, was there even kind of a interest in having that conversation, or is it so removed from reality at the moment that it was just
Yeah, it's far away, Hadi. I hate to say it, it's far away. And, you know, we could get into a technical conversation about what peace would look like, but in, you've seen that conversation elsewhere. It would have to look like um, like Gaza, run not by Hamas, but by some kind of version of the Palestinian Authority that's backed up by Arab countries who would help rebuild Gaza and with an empowered Palestinian Authority. And as part of that, there would have to be a more moderate Israeli government willing to take more steps towards a two-state solution. I think those kinds of things are they're very far away. What I focused on, because, I believe you have to have hope, is I kind of, at the end of my trip, I stopped by a school that was founded by this woman is named Ora, and his name is Ihab, and he's Arab and she's Jewish. And they met at some kind of hippie-like retreat. They got married the next day, believe it or not. And their parents wouldn't talk to them for years because Ora's Jewish father was furious. She married an Arab, and his family had been tried to teach him to hate Jews. And yet they married and founded a school with hundreds of kids now. And there's Ora with one of the Muslim women who helped her run and found the school. And I kind of ended the book, as you can see those kids in the back. I ended the book saying I went to another area where there were a bunch of kids playing together. And I think my last words in the book were, let me just read them to you because it has a little bit of hope. And I said, as I begin to walk out, I pass a play area. There are about 25 kids together, Arab and Jewish. I decide to pause and count how many there are of each, that I cannot tell one from the other.
That is beautiful, and I do hope that that is the future. And the great thing is that exists right now, maybe in kind of small portions, but that does exist, and that's kind of going back to what we were discussing, which is there's almost two Israels. There's the Israel where the communities are mixed and they're working together and there's cohesion, and then there's kind of the other Israel that a lot of us, or a lot of people in the Arab world where I come from, kind of connect to and focus on. I wish we can kind of build and kind of fuel that other part of the cohesion kind of segment.
Yeah, there has to be hope. As I said many times in the book, if there was one line in the book where I repeated a line, I said, when you go there, you realize that many other peoples have come and gone, Babylonians and Romans and Ottomans, and two are still primarily left, the Arab and the Jew. And this is the land where their prophets walked, and where their fathers and maybe even their sons and others died. It's where the land that is part of their souls is, and they will always be there. They're sentenced together by both history and geography and even faith. And so there just has to be a way.
Yeah, that's great. And so if someone would read your book, what is it that they would what kind of experience would you take them on by reading that book?
Well, we read a lot about what's going on over there, and often it's done through the lens of one side or the other. Even descriptions of incidents that happen there, war incidents, it's always one side or the other, describing it politically. And most of the tweets and commentaries there are about, politics arguing one side or the other. And I just felt there had to be room for a book that just took people there and heard regular voices on both sides. There were times I was told, as I was looking around for connections to talk to people, somebody said, "Oh, I could get you an interview with the head of the Israeli Navy. I can really get you a great interview." And I said, I don't care. I don't care about that guy. I want to talk to the 23-year-old soldier that's in a Humvee in Gaza and what he feels. And the same in the Palestinian side, I could have talked to high-ranking members of the Palestinian Authority and said, I don't want that. I want to talk to just a regular teacher who's trying to make a living in Bethlehem, because the Israelis have cut back on regular folks in Ramallah. Like there's a chapter in Ramallah. This would be interesting for folks to read about. The reason I went to Ramallah is I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and not sure if you remember this incident, Hadi, but there was a terrible tragedy in Burlington, Vermont, where some person, some kind of crazy guy, saw three young college students with keffiyehs on walking and shot all three of them. And,
I didn't hear about
this
that. No,
quiet,
I
pardon
didn't hear
me?
about that. No.
Yeah, it was a big news here. And one of the most badly injured lives in my own city where Brown University is, and one of the Ivy Leagues. And he is paralyzed now from the waist down. And so when I went to Ramallah, I went with his childhood best friend,
Mm.
and who also, I mean, it's an amazing story. These two kids from Ramallah, got into American Ivy League school, Brown University, and they're roommates there.
Wow.
And so I went through Ramallah with, I spent the day with this great young man named Abood, who told me about, growing up with his friend and their dreams and how they got to American and Ivy League school and this tragedy happened. But he was so proud of showing me Ramallah. He just was so proud of his town. And he showed me Rukab's ice cream. He said, why don't we have Rukab's ice cream in America? And he said some funny things. It's just where I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but he said some kind of funny, unexpected things. I said, well, what are you and Hisham, Abood and Hisham? I said, what do you find about America that's different or what do you find that's better in the West Bank than in America? And he said, oh my God, the American public bathrooms are so gross. They're so much cleaner on the West Bank. So that's the kind of book it is. It talks about real people talking about real things that I think you could relate to, both in a personal way and, of course, in a broader way, as I talk about what folks are facing in the midst of war.
Yeah, that's beautiful because you don't usually get that. Unfortunately, with social media, what's amplified is the extremes, and so you don't get the actual full picture of the standard normal people living in those areas. It's always just the one extreme there or the other extreme there. That's why it usually gets amplified. So it seems like it's a lot of stories, the people that are impacted by what's happening there. Where can people find that book?
Well, it was actually banned on Amazon
Yeah. So
at first. And
was that just random, or was there a reason?
well, there was another book. There was an October 7th book that was banned too. And so I think that this whole kind of this attitude where everyone has to bring their politics to it, Amazon has a process where they review every book that they put up there. It's a black box. It's opaque. You don't know what their decision making is, and they blocked my book, even though I was once a Pulitzer Prize finalist for international reporting, and that's the kind of book it is. So it's ridiculous to block a book like that. But I think it was a biased gatekeeper who just felt, oh, well, this is another, this might have the Israeli perspective in it. Maybe he looked at it, and even though I think it's balanced, he said, I don't want the Israeli perspective in there anywhere. And they blocked it until there was press coverage about the ban, and then it was finally released. But so it is now. It's now out of Amazon book jail.
That's good.
And you could find it. You can find The Holy Land at War on Amazon now that it's out of. Of course, if Amazon hears me talking about them that way, maybe they'll pull it off. But no, it's out of Amazon book jail now, and it's. I think it's probably the most balanced and just human account of what it's like to be there. You could save yourself a ticket to Jerusalem, Ramallah, and Khan Yunis, and read my book. It takes you there.
Yeah, and it's just so easy because a lot of people are always saying, that they're analyzing the situation from a very logical place of, they should react like this and the other people should react like that. But obviously, when you're there experiencing and going through what those people are experiencing, it's a very different reaction, and your thinking is very different from a place that's just detached, like where we are. Just lastly, um, you know, having gone to Gaza, West Bank, and Israel in January 2024, what was the biggest change to your belief or how you viewed the conflict since going there?
I think you mean how if I view the conflict differently,
Yeah,
I think I would have to go back to the same answer I gave. So let's just come full circle from where we kind of began with. I think that you see these images of upheaval, and certainly there is upheaval and devastation in Gaza. There's no way around it. That in Israel itself and the West Bank, which is very much, in the mix as places under the cloud of war, places that should be in upheaval during war. And yes, and much of the West Bank is a very difficult place right now. But between Jerusalem and Ramallah, I just still found this just absolute, this absolute spirit of normalcy, this kind of commitment that we spirit of normalcy, even though every day is full of heartache and tragedy, we have to keep living. And so I came away not expecting to find that. I didn't think I'd find when I landed in Israel a surprising normalcy. I didn't think when I went to Ramallah I would find a surprising normalcy. And I did, and it speaks of how both Jews and Palestinians have a rage for continuing to live even in the midst of difficult times.
Beautiful. That's awesome. If people wanted to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on, if you feel free to just look me up online, they can find me. I do have a website called markpatinkin.com, and I'm at markpatinkin@gmail. That's my name. But if you just remember the name of the book, The Holy Land at War, I'm Googleable. Is that a word, Hadi? Googleable?
It is nowadays. It is, and we'll put all the links on the description.
Yeah, but tell your friend, if any of your listeners are interested in buying the book, if you buy the book and tell 3 friends to buy the book, I'll send you a set of steak knives.
Ooh, that's very attractive there.
That's what we used to do that's what they used to do in America to get people to sign up for a bank account or something. So I don't know if that translates internationally, but
we'll find out.
I'll send you
We'll
send you a special gift.
Perfect. Well, Mark, thank you so much for sharing your experience and having this conversation. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Gadi. As I said, you're you're the best kind of interviewer. You listen and you make it a conversation. So you're doing a very nice job, and thank you for airing this important issue.
Thank you.